here now, so we may as well start. Welcome everyone. Jane Montanaro, Executive Director of Preservation Connecticut, and thank you all for joining us today for our session on talking about preservation, preserving the history of Black churches. We're really excited to have Jathan Martin here with us today, the curator of I'm Building Me a Home. Just a quick intro of who we are at Preservation Connecticut. This is an image of our headquarters on Whitney Avenue in Hamden, the Eli Whitney Boarding House. We are a staff of 8. I introduced myself already. Chris Wiegren is our deputy director. He's our in-house architectural historian, author of Connecticut Architecture, 100 Stories, and he is the editor of our preservation newsletter. He monitors our easement program. Renee Tribert is our preservation services manager. She runs our Making Places Mills website database and outreach with mill owners and municipalities. And she also coordinates all of our fee-for-service work, historic tax credit applications, and National Register nominations, state register nominations. Jordan Sorensen, our development director, helps us with all things development and social media and membership, and also works on special projects, doing nominations to state and national register and other assorted projects. Kristen Hopewood is our development assistant, assisting with outreach and event programming, and she is the one to contact for our historic properties exchange. If you have a threatened property that you'd like some help promoting. And of course, our circuit riders, Mike Farino, Brad Scheid, and Stacy Barrow, who are our technical service staff who come out into the community to work with homeowners, municipalities, nonprofit organizations, anyone charged with stewardship of a property or wanting to work with their community to save a historic property. They're the ones to call to come out and work with you and get going. Preservation Connecticut is a statewide nonprofit historic preservation organization. We were established by a special act of the Connecticut General Assembly in 1975, and we work in partnership with the State Historic Preservation Office, with all the local historic preservation organizations in the state, municipalities, individuals, really everyone who has an interest in historic property. And we do a lot of education education programs like this today. We're really excited to be able to be bringing you new speakers and new topics and an opportunity to chat with important topics and issues in preservation in your communities, and to encourage you to join us in the chat. You can write questions in the chat, or you can, speak up at the end of the program and get the conversation going. So with that, I will turn it over to Jathan. He is, like I said, the curator of Building Me a Home that just ended at the Yale Divinity School. Jathan, I will let you take it from here.
Thank you, and thank you to Preservation Connecticut and everyone present for affording me the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and try to hop into the presentation. Okay. One second. Okay. I'm having a little technical difficulty sharing my screen.
Says you've started screen share.
Yeah, but it's like a code it's asking me for. If you give me 1 second, I'm gonna give the owner of this laptop. I'm so sorry for this.
That's okay.
Okay.
It's okay, people are still joining us, so the audience is filling in.
All right.
Now we can see your screen.
Okay. So I wanted to start my talk by just prefacing how I came into this work and why preservation of Black churches and Black sacred spaces are important to me. I find that whether it be an attacks on our sacred spaces or our sacred bodies, the denigration and desecration of Black life has continuously been on public exhibition here in the United States. While manifested in many forms, this country's relationship with anti Black violence is inextricably tied to religion. Christianity has housed the exhibition of chapels on slave plantations, lynching picnics after Sunday worship, and the fiery crosses raging outside of Black churches across the South. In 2011, I was acquainted with the severity of this reality as I watched the church my great great grandfather built be burned down by a white teenager in South Florida. I wanted to, and this is just a small clip of the church burning, and we won't stay here long. Okay, back to my presentation. Okay. And so this is 11 Worship Center Holiness Church of the Living God, burning approximately 3:30 a.m. The church was, as I said, was built in the early 20th century by my great great grandfather. And at the site of the fire, I watched as the history and the memorabilia and seemingly the church's legacy were singed. My lived experience exhibits the statistical attacks that Black sacred spaces and Black people have endured. And so, standing in these ashes, historically and personally, I discerned a keen interest in the preservation and memorialization of Black life through religious history. So, my passion for archival work led me to found the Black Church Historical Preservation Project, which has thus far preserved the oral histories of 14 African American churches here in New Haven, Connecticut. This project allowed me to strategize about the ways that oral histories might be documented during the COVID-19 pandemic. Through a digital and in-person exhibit housed at Yale Divinity School, the project provided the discourse of history, materiality, scholarship, and controversies within the Black church. The interviews conducted for the exhibit are now archived online, which provides listeners a glimpse into the beauties of each institution. As a testament to the relevance of the work, the archival project now extends to churches located in Bridgeport, Connecticut, a strand of churches in Indianapolis, Indiana that were slated to close by the end of 2020, and the Mother African American Episcopal Zion Church in Harlem. And so I want to take time to just give a cursory view of the website and how my team and I thought through this work. So we know that a lot of churches have their histories written down already, but we wanted to create biographical sketches of each church to go along with their interview. So we interviewed clergy members, lay members, church historians, all trying to really just think through the ways that they tell the story and the narrative of their institution. And I think that it gave us a glimpse, not into the history, but like an ethnographic type of project as we saw why people still attend churches. What is the value of the Black church in 2021 or 2022? How long do they see the churches, Black churches, lasting post-pandemic and those values? So we interviewed things that spanned the Women's Day events from the different choirs that sing at each church and what songs people enjoy. So I hope that you take time after this call, if you haven't already, to just indulge or engage in some of these interviews. So just go to my process really quick, and I call it Aretha Franklin's lessons. And so I'm going to play this clip. Okay. Didn't know that.
Lauryn Hill was saying that after you had done the vocal session and you had left, and I don't know if it was a rose, it's still a rose, but something like that. She said she went into the booth and she said it smelled like church. It was pure and full of energy.
And what does church smell like?
It smells like old books to me.
What church did you go to?
Well, I went to United Church. It smelled like old hymnaries and old books.
My church doesn't smell like that.
What does it smell like?
My church smells like a lot of good fried chicken and homemade rolls and fried corn and things like that. Unfortunately, we didn't have any of that on the set of A Rose Is Still a Rose.
Does singing feel like church to you?
It depends on what I'm singing.
So I think there are many things we can learn from Ms. Franklin, but I really had to sit and interrogate Aretha's question, what does church smell like? From that starting point, I asked myself, what does church sound like?
If you're trying to lose belly fat, stop doing cardio. This sounds backwards, right? Or not.
Let's go there. Is the sound gone? Okay, perfect. And what does church look like? So when we're thinking about establishing archives of the Black church, we must engage our senses, because the very essence of the Black church is material culture. Now, I'm not suggesting that we try to make our archives smell like fried chicken, but if we had a chance to peer into the closets of the church mothers, we'll understand how Black people have redefined their positionality in the world through their attire. Or we would more likely see the ways the Black church has participated in misogyny or misogynoir, where we have certain codes for women or codes for men in the church. We could also look at the banners of the walls in the Black church to understand the ways that Black churches have turned police stations, retail stores, and even white churches into sanctuaries where their Holy Spirit resides. Or as ethnomusicologist Wyatt T. Walker says, if we listen to what Black people are singing religiously, we'll be provided a clue as to what is happening to them in their social realm. And so I hope that gave a cursory view of the project, and I'm excited to engage a little more in conversation with you now.
Great, thank you for that, Jathan.
Simple way to complete your physique in as little as 12 weeks.
A semester of schooling on Zoom, you would think that I have this down pat, but I thank you for your grace.
Always technical issues to keep us on our toes. One of the questions that came in before the program started, someone wanted to know, how do you know what's worthy to preserve? Papers, photo, memorabilia, when you're looking at archiving, what's your selection process?
Yeah, I think that my thought process again draws from what church, drawing on those senses, but Black churches archives span the gamut. And I think that that's why a lot of people automatically assume that Black churches are political centers or are the social clubs, because so much of Black life is housed at Black church, or so much of Black life has been housed within the Black church. And so with that being said, I I don't think that the question becomes like, what do we know? I mean, what should we preserve? It is more of a question of how much can we preserve, because there's so much housed within these Black churches. I'm like, if we take a look at Varick, I mean, it was a stop on the Underground Railroad. So the history spans, and they have the archives there. It's just how we might be able to preserve those things. So I don't think that they're, as you engage the material, I think that you will be able to parse through that answer.
And I'm curious, are you doing this all on your own? Do you have a team?
So the first round, I definitely had to have a team because I am a student at the Divinity School, so I really drew on the other students within the Divinity School who are interning at Black churches here in New Haven as a requirement for their supervised ministry. So, but I'm also working with a faculty member who is helping some churches in Virginia do this kind of work themselves. And I think that's the beauty of oral histories and preserving Black churches, is that I think that anyone can do it. Anyone can be in the community and have in that church community and say, well, let's take a Sunday afternoon to sit around and tell the story of this church in the ways that we view it. And from there, the archive is produced, because when we speak on how moved you were on your first Mother's Day service, and you have the memorabilia, you have the church program, you have the church hat you wore, or the church hat your mother wore, you begin to pull the archive together. And I think that while many churches don't have the infrastructure to hold these archives, the digital processing of this archival work really comes in handy, because we can create online profiles of the culture of the Black church. So I did have a team.
I was going to say, seems like a lot of work.
Yeah, I would. It can be. The scheduling and the logistics part of any work is hard, but I think I found that people were so excited to tell the stories of their churches because they've been so intimately involved with them. I had an interview with a woman who joined this particular church as a child, and she's in her 80s now. And she was one of the first members of the church along with her parents. So she tells the story of decorating the church and turning the storefront church into a sanctuary. And so while they're not in that building anymore, that story still has to be archived. And because it tells the ways that Black people were making, and it really birthed the name of the exhibit, I'm Building Me a Home, the ways that even though that's a Negro spiritual and it's talking about heaven, but Black people were on the ground still building homes and still making preparations for life after this point in slavery ended. So that has been very, was my guide, and it really kept me moving as I was just delving in the stories.
And how can we assist in growing this collection, or folks that are interested to tell their stories?
Yes, I think that one thing that I learned over the project is that Yale and the Black community in New Haven have a really fraught relationship. And so there was a big suspicion on why I wanted to archive and preserve the Black churches. And so a lot of my work on the front end had to be building relationships. And I'm sure that an organization like yours, not tied to Yale, would have a little easier time to engage this type of work. But relationship building, but also asking the churches what they value to preserve. I wish I had started off the front with that. But there's so many Black churches here in New Haven that I didn't get to speak to. There are so many Black churches across the Hamden line that I didn't get to speak to. And so, and I think that it would be beautiful if you could tell how colorful the religious center New Haven has, because these churches are not all a part of the same denomination. We use Black church as a way to bring our communities together, but you have Black Episcopalian churches, you have Black Catholic churches here, you have Black Baptists, Black Pentecostals, Black non-denominational churches, and they all are vastly different. And so I think that it would really be beneficial to this space to really understand the religious center that New Haven and the surrounding communities have really built. Churches, I mean, I'm from the South, and so we kind of have pretty standard denominations, but it was so vast here. I think about the United House of Prayer Church here, and it is a foundational church within that denomination here in New Haven, like a headquarter church, or thinking about the different Kojic churches here. So I think being extending the opportunity for these churches to tell their stories and have them documented, but it would be beneficial to really get into these communities and allow them to lead the type of work we want to do.
Yeah, I had the sense when I saw your exhibit that there was a lot in New Haven that we were familiar with, but a lot more out there that we were not familiar with. And how many would you say you still would need to document, just roughly?
Oh, and there will at least be another 15.
Yeah.
One of the pastors said to me, anywhere that you have oppressed people, you will have an excess amount of churches. And so thinking about the ways that how New Haven can be predominantly Black in so many ways. And so there is a church on every corner. And I think the pandemic made it very difficult to reach out to some of these churches because they don't have the infrastructure. So many don't have the infrastructure to have a secretary there every day or have someone on call. And so if the pandemic wasn't happening, I could go on Sunday morning and give a letter and say, I'm here, I'm going to worship with you today, but I would also like to do some preserving of your space. And I hope that the churches that I have already interviewed could be a network for people who want to do this work. And so they could just ask, and I can ask if people will be okay with getting their contact information out. But yeah, I would say at least 15 other churches. And I tried to still highlight some of the ones that I wasn't able to do interviews at, that I could take pictures of and put within the exhibit spot. But yeah.
Do you know where the first Black church in New Haven was located?
So Varick AME, well, as they have been going through different name changes, they take claim to being the first African-American church here in New Haven. And they say they were originally found, their church location was on Hill House, the Hill House district, but on Yale's campus, but it was burned down after they had raised money to, and this was, their church founding is 1818, so somewhere around that time.
I remember that story, yeah.
And the person wanted me to say that they didn't want to be on record saying that it was anything racial that caused the fire. But I mean, if you have a Black church in the most affluent area of New Haven, you can expect that it could have been a racialized attack, but now they're located on Dixwell, and then across the street you have the United Church of Christ, Dixwell Congregational Church, who is founded 1820. So right in there, and sometimes they take jabs at each other whether who was actually the first African American church here in New Haven.
Would you know where the first Black Catholic church was?
Yeah, so Saint Martin's. I want to make sure I'm saying that right. Yes, they are the only Black Catholic church here in New Haven. Make sure, and they have. Just want to make sure I'm saying the name of the church right. St. Martin de Poros, yes. They are the only Black Catholic church here, and they were birthed because Black people didn't feel welcome within the larger Catholic church here in New Haven. And there was still a lot of segregation within the church spaces. And I think the early churches that were founded here in New Haven all have a similar story around this. If I even go back to Varick, they left the Episcopal Church because Black people weren't allowed to partake in sacraments. And so similar things happen that prompt Black people to leave and start their own space. So St. Martin de Poros is the only Black church, Black Catholic church here in New Haven. And their interesting story to me is that they took a old police station and turned it into a Black church, a Black Catholic church, and they have all 7 stages of the cross, and their Jesus is Black in the church. It's a Catholic church in its liturgy, but they still draw on the soulfulness of what we understand the Black church to be. And so, yeah, that is the only one to my knowledge here in New Haven.
Thanks for your questions, Tim. I have a question that came in through the chat. Did the project give you any insights into changing roles of Black churches? And what new directions do you see them moving in now?
New insights. I want to say that the project, I think I have to go back to my childhood. My great-grandparents were pastors. My grandparents and my parents are pastors, all of the same church that I view. So I've grew up in church, and church has kind of been very tethered to me. So I don't think that I was surprised by anything. I was more, but the ways that no matter the church, there's still things that Black churches are having to think through, and they're having to think through the ways, all the social justice topics, from women in leadership to LGBTQ people in the church. And they're all grappling with this in very different ways. And how, if the church is going to continue to be the center of the Black community, as we like to envision during the civil rights movement, there are some key political / policy things that Black churches are having to think through now, because people are finding other sanctuaries. And I think that that's another interesting part to my work. While this project was very tied to Christian churches, Black religion and Black sacred space spans Christian churches. And so it will be interesting to see where Black barbershops and Black beauty salons become a new sanctuary, where women can go to the Black beauty salon and not have to deal with the misogyny or the sexism that they may have to deal with in the pulpits while they're getting their hair ready for church. All these things are tied to each other. And so the to that point, I think that one of the teaching moments for me was the ways that we process the future of the Black church, and how some people can't envision a life without it, while others thinking that it's on its way out. Whether they think that the new wave is a multicultural church, whether they think that they're deeply grieving that their church won't be there anymore, or they believe that because the church is dying down right now, that their goal should be to evangelize in their communities and bring the church back into what it once was. And so those are some of the points that I learned during the process.
Jason?
Yes.
I'm remembering as you talk that in the middle of the 20th century, when women could be ordained in the Presbyterian Church, in different places there was a terrific discussion about, well, what will they wear when they're serving communion? And there was a church in Brooklyn where the not only the ushers, but the members of the session wore a formal attire on communion Sundays. So then there was this big deal about, well, what would the women wear? Well, how will they, what will they wear hats? And if they wear hats, will they have a veil? Will the veil be short enough or too long? And what will the length of their dresses be? It's just interesting that, well, I'm just observing that other churches were going through the same phenomenon that you're talking about. And what you're sharing strikes an interesting memory for me.
Yes, and I think that's part of my intrigue into the Black church space, because while one of the highlights within my in-person exhibit which was very important for me to get, is a traditional, what looks like a traditional nurse uniform, a white dress with the white stockings. That's what ushers wore. And some of them still do within certain Black denominations here. And while these type of adornments could be seen as something to stifle women or to show that women had to dress in this modest or conservative way, which still has to be problematized, the Black women of the church valued their attire as service to God in these ways. So when we just look at something as simple as a nurse uniform, there's a story behind it that doesn't just span personal, but spans the communal space and the political space and the religious space from us just looking at this one artifact. And so I think that, to the earlier question, how do we know what to preserve? Things that open up the conversation past just the material.
Great. Thank you, Tom.
I'm actually, I'm happy to hear you today, because my great grandfather, he was one of the Irish immigrants that built St. Patrick's Church in Enfield, Connecticut. There were no Catholic churches in this town. And I have always wanted to tell that story because it's a very good story. And he was very determined. You know, my name is SMYTH for Smith. And the first priest that they sent from the Archdiocese of Hartford, he was SMYTH.
Mm.
So a little bit more of an Irish thing that people know it is.
Wow. Yeah, and I think that the stories of churches, again, just open up the stories to our lives for many of us. And whether we are religious or not at this point, there still are some connections to our collective histories around the ways that people engage sacred spaces. And for, a country like ours to be birthed under the notion of religious freedoms and but still very Christian inherently, religion is tied to everything. And so our ways to open up the story is to look at what churches are doing and how those things affect our lives.
In our work at the Preservation Connecticut, we're always first looking at the building itself, and we have tools to bring to communities to preserve the physical structure. And it's just so wonderful to see how important these structures are beyond the physical landmark, status of the building. We know the wonderful resources that they offer to the communities with shelters and other resources, but then this whole, material, emotional history that is also embedded in that, and to see that you're capturing that full picture and the full story is just really wonderful, and what we need to be looking at and remembering and focusing our attention on.
Yeah, and I hope that these projects could merge, because a lot of the churches don't have the endowments that certain churches, particularly white churches, would have to keep these buildings up. And so a lot of the histories will not only fall because of like racialized terror and church burning down, but also not having the member base there to get the roof fixed, or to stop the leak, so there is many ways to approach this conversation. But I think it all comes down to us valuing the histories of these spaces enough to put that type of work into. And once we do that by learning the stories and sitting down with the people and listening. So I appreciate you all taking the time to have this conversation with me.
Wendy, you had a question?
I do indeed. Thank you so much for this really interesting presentation. I so enjoyed it. I would like to ask sort of more of a nuts and bolts question. All this work that you have done with regard to archival information in churches, some churches are very good about having space and being able to maintain some of these documents, some of which can be quite old and quite fragile. Is there a mechanism, or have we had a speaker who actually has helped us understand how to better catalog and maintain this very old, just the physical stuff of old archival material?
Yeah, I want to say that spans a little bit further than my expertise. Mainly because a lot of my preservation work has, or archival work has been digital. Mm-hmm. So with some of the churches in Indianapolis that were slated to close, they had documents there from like their first council of the church, and books that you, again, like you said, very fragile, had to hold. And so we would take pictures of the documents and then upload them into a software that would code them in a library fashion. But I don't know. I don't know if I could tell you what type of folders you would need to put things in, or what the temperature should be in the room for each of these documents. But I do think that digitally is a very necessary first step because of the fragility of just the space. And so anything could happen to Black churches. Black churches are still burning. And I think that gratefully, Connecticut never has had that trend. But if we think back to 2018, we have a series of churches in the Louisiana parish, St. Landry's Parish in Louisiana, who were burned down around the same time as the Notre Dame Cathedral is burned. So when we think about just the lack of regard for Black religious spaces, getting things archived digitally is a necessary step. I can't show you the photos of my church's origin because they were in the church during the fire. And so it's very necessary that we find the right cataloging software that we might be able to archive these just singular items online.
So just as a final comment to someone like yourself, because you're much younger, we're counting on someone like yourself or people who have similar interests to be able to help us devise that plan, to make that plan come together. And clearly a method by which, for example, churches that may exceed 200 years and have some very, very old documents, to put those into better holding location. Yeah. Ultimately, to be able to at least minimally preserve the material, if not the original document, at least a replica of the original document.
Yes, and then that's very valuable and important. I think that the only hiccup would be the relationship building, because so many churches are hesitant to give out their most precious memorabilia. And so I think that knowing and letting people do it on their terms, because I mean, at the end of the day, our preservation work, we know that it's only in assistance to the community. It's not that we're trying to exploit, but we still have to kind of build up the trust in ways that these communities have. I mean, they have fair suspicion of researchers. They have fair suspicions of archive or work that spans the history of these people, the land that we live on, being native land, and ways that research has disrupted these communities, and especially museum space. So,
thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Elizabeth, you've had your hand raised. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. This has been an amazing presentation, and I work in adaptive reuse. And so you mentioned this whole inevitability sometimes where there's not the funds and at place to be able to maintain the structures, which of course is like the first and foremost desire. But say we get to this place where these churches do need to close, and now the question is, will it be raised? Will it be preserved? Will it be adapted into a new use? And so my mind, as an example, in terms of adaptive reuse that we see right here in Connecticut and right here in New Haven, specifically where I'm at, is the recent rehab of the Duncan Hotel that is now the Graduate Hotel. And they've totally, brought back these different, memorabilia of like old Yale College days and all this. And it's been embedded in the interior decor. And so I'm thinking, like, have you ever seen or witnessed a Black church that, was preserved, had to close, a developer stepped in, did a new thing, and like honored, like through the memorabilia, through the interior decor, like the past life? Like, have you seen any satisfying adaptive reuse of Black churches?
No. While I was in Indianapolis, one of their oldest churches in Indianapolis had closed and is being turned into a Hilton, and so it's going to have the fare of knowing that it used to be a church, because the outside of is going to stay the same. But I don't think that when we get to the heart of what makes Black churches, that would be exhibited within the hotel. But there, in that same time, these churches are thinking through these questions of what to do with the buildings, because they own them, many of them, but they just don't have the funds to keep them open. And some of them don't have the people to keep them open still. And during it was about 5 churches that I would visit. And so some of them are thinking, about creating the archive within the sanctuary building on like one of the churches that are going to close, and everyone kind of just pour in their archives to the most sturdy church. But we're still working with people who may not have the connections to a Preservation Connecticut, or may not have connections to the local university to get these kind of things off the ground and to know the answers to the questions that I can't ask, like Wendy offered, like what's the temperature needs to be in the room to make sure that these documents don't mold or things like that. But the beautiful thing about the space and the documents that I was seeing, that they lasted since the early 1800s. So there's someone still having enough wherewithal to maintain the documents. But I don't know that I have seen, to your original question, ways that Black churches have been honored once their church has been bought, or yeah.
We have work to do.
Yes. Thank you for the question.
Sil, you had your hand raised?
My name is Sil Wolford. I'm from Delaware. It's a wonderful discussion, and it's the kind of problems that we're dealing here in Delaware and all over the country. When we try to preserve histories of churches, the first thing you say is oral history, but I didn't go in that direction. I'm a genealogist also, as well as a historian. And unbeknownst to the folks who were in these churches or started these churches, I went back and did their genealogy for 200 years and did 7 generations of Black folks in these churches, marriage licenses, death certificates, etc., even going back again to the slave owners, and even having identified a slave grave. This is not a abandoned cemetery. This is where the white folks used to throw the Black folks when, they were done with them. And so I would like to share with you my research of, again, not having to go in and discuss with the folks in the church, but using genealogy to do this. And again, I'm sure, as you can imagine, the churches that I'm dealing with, the founders of the church made an X. They couldn't read or write. So when we're talking about church documents, we say there are no church documents. And folks kind of look at us and say, there had to be church document. Well, they can't read or write, there are no church documents. And literally, these churches were like mid-1800s, and the first documents, as we describe them, didn't show up until the 1900s. And much of the original Black church was an oral tradition. and a musical tradition rather than a biblical tradition. And so again, we're trying to translate this into something we can understand, but we have to identify the environment in which these folks were living. They were illiterate, they were ex-slaves, they didn't keep records. And so, and even when you're doing oral histories, some of their memory fades. But and folks look at me, well, I talk to the oral historians and say, well, that's wrong. And they said, well, how do you get this? And I say, the documents speak to you. And then they know I'm crazy. And so they ignore me. But once you put this series of documents together and talk about 30, 40, or 50 families that you're looking at in genealogy, and you're looking at communities and showing intermarriages, the picture is incredible in terms of learning about Black life in the pre-slavery. And again, you're talking pre-slavery there back to 1812. And it is a beautiful mural of life during that period of time.
Yes, I appreciate all that you've said, and also giving me another form of methodology to think through as I engage this work. And I think that's why materiality is so important for me when thinking through the Black church space, because, like you said, so much of it is not textual. It's found and learned through the smells, the touches, the what we see in the Black church. And one of my guiding questions as I thought about my exhibition work and how I would curate the space is, what needs to be present for me to know that this is a Black church? And who needs to be present for us to understand that this is a Black church? And you need the choir, you need the usher, you need the preacher. These are all traditions that aren't necessarily written about. Or some people don't even have the archive of the photo of it, but the story and the tradition still stands. We know it's a tradition because in 2021, nurses aren't still wearing white button-down dresses with stockings, but ushers are. They're still wearing these because it is a tradition that has been passed on. And so to your point, the genealogy is so important to the space because Black people don't call church just church, they call it their church home. So this is a place that they identify as family, and these families are pouring into the space. And so, yeah.
Could you give me your contact information so I could send it to you? Can you give me anything?
Please. And I can just say it out loud, and I can also put it in the chat. I think I can put it in the chat. Okay, but my email address is my first name and my last name, so Jathan.Martin.
Jason is spelled?
Jathan like Nathan, so Jathan, Nathan with the J.
Okay.
.Martin at Yale, YALE.edu. So Jathan.Martin at Yale.edu.
Thank you. I'm going to have to run, but I'll send you the information and hopefully we can stay in touch.
Yes, I hope so too. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you. Ruth, you have a question?
Yes, I have a question. I'm up here in Boston. I'm just listening in, and I'm an archivist and records manager, so I was interested in listening in today. I had a question of, have you thought of using this as a vehicle for outreach to schools within Connecticut, and as this type of work with even private Christian schools, doing an outreach to them to possibly get interns to want to come on board to aid, because maybe there might be students who are interested in this type of work? And also, have you done an outreach to Southern Connecticut State University? Because have you done outreach to the archival community within Connecticut? And as well, I was wondering if there has been an outreach to the storytelling community, or if you've ever thought of doing a sort of a TED Talk.
Yeah.
Just several ideas. And do you see an opportunity for this to be a bridge builder to new projects and to outreach to further churches and to further communities?
Thank you for that question. I like to think of myself as an amateur coming to this work. And I like to think of everyone that I'm in communication with as us all coming to this space as amateurs and just learning how we might do this best. And so in my research of thinking through people to like partner with outside of my sphere of influence here at the Divinity School, I would think, or I actually visited Preservation Connecticut's website, but when I saw that it was more so about the physical building, I decided not to reach out to. Because we were working through COVID, I didn't reach out to schools because so many things were happening, and I didn't even give some of that thought. But I was in partnership with the Greater New Haven African American Historical Society, and their archives are on Southern's campus. And during the pandemic, Southern was closed, so we couldn't actually access the archives. But through just building connections with their board and using students in that way, we did have a couple of students from the New Haven community on our team, and they interviewed the churches that they attend. They helped with like the online graphics of different things. But definitely, I do think that this work is a fertile ground for other projects to grow and for other churches to be documented. I said briefly, but there's a church in Bridgeport, Connecticut that I will be doing a similar archival project on, but it's really mainly based on my connections and the connections that I've built as a student in Divinity School. Because I'm from Florida, I'm not really from the space. And so I have tried my best to make the connections within the community as possible, so that they can tell me and show me their New Haven and their churches. But I don't have the convenience of knowing all the resources here in Connecticut.
Thank you for your question, Ruth.
You're welcome.
Yeah, there's a lot of activity in the chat. Your presentation, Jathan, is sparking a lot of ideas and conversation and people talking about how we can work together better and connect. And this has really been such a fascinating talk, and we really appreciate you spending time with us to share your work with us. And it's really important work for us to be paying attention to and supporting.
I really appreciate the time, and I've enjoyed the conversation. It's been a great teaching tool for me as I think about how I might go further in the work, and I hope that we stay in communication.
I think we will. There's so much. This is just the tip. I feel like just the introduction here. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Y'all have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.